Go ahead and stay married to the military. I'm in Cancun with Chloe. We're never coming back. The message landed on my phone at 2:07 a.m. Below those 3 sentences sat a photograph. My husband, his arm wrapped tight around my best friend of 20 years. And resting against her collarbone, catching the flash, was the diamond pendant I had bought her with my own combat pay. I read it standing in full body armor. Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan. The cold came straight through the plates and settled into my spine. 12 hours before that message, I had trusted my life to men I had known for 6 weeks, strangers who would step in front of a bullet for me without a heartbeat of hesitation. The man who had shared my bed for 2 decades used that same trust to bury a knife between my shoulder blades. No officer training on this earth prepares you for a wound like that. My hands did not shake. My eyes went dry and flat and cold. My husband forgot one small detail. My name is Major Emily Myers, and when the home front turns into hostile territory, the purge begins. Before I take you any further, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly want to know how this story ends. And leave me a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are sitting right now. My heart rate never climbed. I want you to sit with that for a second. I did not scream into the desert wind. I did not drop my rifle in the dirt or press my back to the wall and slide down it. 2 decades of discipline took the wheel and held it dead straight, running the one creed that had kept me breathing through 3 deployments. Emotions come last. Risk elimination comes first. I said the words to myself once, flat as a supply checklist. Then I pulled up my secure banking app over the satellite link, standing there in the wind with grit ticking against my collar. For 11 years, my husband's construction company had survived on exactly one thing, and it was never his talent. It was my paycheck. Every time I shipped out, the money I earned under mortar fire kept his sinking business afloat. He called his subcontractors thieves. He called the inspectors crooks. He called the whole economy a rigged game built to crush a hard-working man. He never once called himself the leak in the boat. 3 years back, he talked me into co-signing a loan for a new work truck, all diesel and chrome the rig that was finally going to turn the company around. The company never turned. That truck sat idle in the driveway most months, while he told anyone who would listen that his wife was overseas chasing medals instead of raising a family. He spent my deployments the way other men spend a lottery win. I was the lottery win, and for 11 years, I never once knew I had been cashed. The joint credit ledger loaded on the small screen, one line after another, glowing red in the dark. Business class tickets. A resort on the Riviera Maya. Boutiques with names I could not pronounce. He was burning through my blood money while I slept 4 hours a night under artillery cover, and he was doing it fast. I bought that pendant on the pier 2 Christmases back, the last time I was home long enough to matter. Chloe cried when she opened the box. She held my hand across the table and swore she would never have gotten through her divorce without me. 20 years of birthdays and hospital waiting rooms and 2 in the morning phone calls. She wore my gift in that photograph like a trophy pinned to her chest by the man I married. My grip tightened on the phone until the plastic creaked. There is one rule about a hostile force. You do not sit down and argue with it. You cut its supply line and you let it starve in the field. I dialed the account security number printed on the back of my card standing in the dirt, and I bypassed every ounce of grief and went straight to protocol. A woman answered, calm and scripted. "Thank you for calling account security. How can I help you tonight?" "I need to freeze every card on my accounts." I said, my voice level as a table. "Effective this second. All of them." She asked me to verify my identity. I gave her the numbers without a pause, and then I walked her down the list myself. I froze the emergency card my husband carried in his wallet, the one he swore was only for a burst pipe or a dead battery. I froze the spare card I had handed my best friend a year earlier on the night she sat at my kitchen table, sobbing that she could not find work and did not know how she would feed herself. I dropped every credit limit to 0. I wiped the 2-step password so no one could reset a single thing from a beach chair. "That is a total freeze on all secondary cards, ma'am," the operator confirmed. "Nothing will authorize anywhere." "Good," I said, and I ended the call. For 11 months, that money had run one direction, only out of my accounts and straight into their hands, and it took me under a minute on a satellite line in the dirt to shut the valve for good. A logistics officer does not win a fight by screaming at the enemy across the wire. She wins it by owning the supply. I had just cut theirs down to zero from the far side of the planet, and neither of them had even felt it land yet. Somewhere out over the water, my husband and my best friend were still floating on my dime, ordering another round. Not one clue that I had just cut the engines off their little paradise and left them gliding toward the rocks. I closed the banking app. I opened the message thread with my husband and looked at his grand declaration of freedom one final time. I typed 2 words. I hit send. I turned the phone face down against my thigh and I let it go dark. Good luck. Out there on that front line, I would hand my canteen to a man whose last name I could barely spell, and he would hand me his without a word. There was a young corporal in my unit, a kid from a town smaller than mine, who split the last of his rations with me the night a supply drop went sideways and the whole camp went hungry. He did not know my rank pay. He did not know my account balances. He only knew I was one of his, and for him that was the entire equation. That is what loyalty costs, and that is what it buys. And men who have almost nothing seem to understand it far better than men who have everything. My own husband looked at that same loyalty at 20 years of it and saw a bank account with legs. He had a warm bed, a paid mortgage, and a wife who mailed her whole heart home in every letter, and he still went hunting for a way to sell all of it for cash. The corporal who split his rations owed me nothing and gave me everything he had. The man who married me owed me everything and gave me a knife in the back. I stopped confusing the two the night that message hit my phone. A day later, my C-17 touched down in Ohio. I drove out through the quiet tree-lined streets. On a dead Tuesday night, my duffel still packed my uniform, still stained with 2 continents of dust. The red brick house sat under the maples, exactly where I had left it. For years, I had looked at that house and seen the one safe place on the map. Now, I sat in the driveway with my hands on the wheel, and I saw a compromised forward base with my husband's fingerprints on every surface inside it. I did not go in. I did not drop the duffel on the porch or turn a single key. I pulled out my phone and dialed a locksmith who ran an all-night emergency line, and then I stood on the front step and watched the streetlights hum while I waited. I was not going to sleep 1 hour inside a space he could still walk into. The last time I wore my dress uniform in that house, my husband looked at the new oak leaf on my shoulder and said flat and mean, "Must be nice, getting paid to play soldier while I break my back for nothing." I stopped wearing it home after that. I started folding my ribbons into the bottom drawer tucked under the winter socks, so the man I married would never have to feel small standing next to his own wife. My own mother pulled me aside at my wedding and told me a good marriage means always leaving room for a man's pride. So I left room. I kept leaving room until there was no floor left under my own boots. I told myself that was keeping the peace. What I was really doing was feeding a snake in my own bedroom. The locksmith's van rolled up around 2:45 a.m. He was an older man, gray at the temples, and he paused the second he stepped out and clocked the rank insignia on my collar and the way I was standing square and still watching the street like it might move on me. He pulled his drill from the toolbox and looked at the dark windows. Changing every lock at this hour, he asked, one eyebrow up. "Is something wrong, Major?" I looked him dead in the eye and there was nothing in my voice at all. "Nothing," I said. "Everything is just being put exactly where it belongs." I stood guard while the drill screamed into the night and tore the old deadbolt out of the door. The front entry, the garage, the back patio slider, every pin, every cylinder replaced one by one while I watched the road. He worked and I counted the streetlights and neither of us said much of anything. When he was done, he wiped his hands on a shop rag and offered to cut me a spare set for family the way he probably offered everyone. He held the fresh brass keys out in his palm, still warm from the machine. I took the single key and shook my head at the rest. "I'm never handing the keys to my life to anyone ever again," I told him. I paid him in cash. I walked inside my own house for the first time in 11 months, and I threw the heavy new deadbolt behind me, and I walked the house room by room with the single new key still closed in my fist. His recliner held the shape of him. His coffee mug sat in the sink where he had left it 11 months back. The place felt less like a home now and more like a compound I had just retaken from a hostile force, and I cleared it the same way, one room at a time. My father wore this uniform before me. He came home from his own war quiet and hard and proud, and he raised his only daughter to believe that the cloth on your shoulder means you keep your word and you cover your people no matter the cost. He died before he ever got to see me make major. Standing in that silent hallway, I felt glad for the first time in my life that he was not alive to see what the man I married had done with the name he gave me. My mother had passed 2 winters before him. I had no children to phone. Every scrap of blood family I had left inside those walls had already lined up on the other side. I bagged his mug and his mail and set the shape of him out on the curb, and only then did I lie down on top of the covers, boots still on. And for the first time since that message hit my phone, I slept. At exactly 7:18 a.m., 3 hard knocks rattled the brand new front door. I came awake all at once, already reading the room before my feet hit the floor. I crossed to the door and checked the peephole. 2 cops stood on my porch. One older heavyset, a veteran by the way he carried it. One young, a rookie, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I opened the door 4 inches and left the security chain locked across the gap. The older officer took off his hat and his eyes went straight to the way I was standing. "Good morning, Mrs. Myers," he said. "Your husband just called from Mexico. He's accusing you of locking him out, freezing his finances, and illegally seizing joint marital assets." Something cold pulled at the corner of my mouth. My husband cheated on me at 2 a.m. on the far side of the country. He bounced deeper into Mexico the instant the cards declined. And now he was working my local precinct like a con man works a mark, calling these 2 men to my door to do the muscle he never had. I unhooked the chain and let them into the living room. I did not offer them tears. I did not offer them a frantic, stumbling explanation. I walked to the steel wall safe, bolted into the closet, spun the dial, and pulled out 3 slate gray folders, each one labeled in my own hard block print. I had built those files the way I built a supply manifest. Every claim backed, every page tabbed, nothing left to a stranger's imagination. I set the first folder on the glass coffee table with a flat snap. "Here is the deed to the house," I said, and I tapped the highlighted line with 1 finger. Purchased entirely with my inheritance and my combat savings, 2 full years before I ever married that man. His name has never once existed on this title. The young officer Reed shifted his weight and cleared his throat. But he insisted this was a shared marital home. He said half a question. I cut him off before the sentence finished, and I dropped my voice into the low, clean register I use to give an order that will not be repeated. "His delusions carry no legal weight, officer." I opened the second folder and laid it flat beside the first. Retirement accounts in my name alone. Bank statements in my name alone. Every investment I had built through a decade of deployments walled off and untouchable. Then I set my phone down on top of the deed and turned the screen to face them. The photo, the message, the timestamp, 2:07 a.m. The whole temperature of that room turned over. The suspicion drained out of the veteran's face and something else took its place. Respect, the kind that snaps into posture. My husband thought he could point a badge at me and watch me fold. Instead, he walked himself straight into the barrel of the plain, documented truth. The 2 of them looked at that phone, looked at the deed, and looked at me standing there in a dusty uniform with nothing left to prove. Barnes touched the brim of his hat. Reed gave me a small apologetic nod. They let themselves out, and the cruiser pulled off my street without its lights on. The moment their taillights vanished off the end of my street, I locked myself in the home office and pulled the blinds down tight. I have spent my whole career moving millions of dollars in defense logistics across 3 continents, tracking every crate, every pallet, every gallon of fuel down to the last decimal. I do not tolerate a blind spot on my own books. I sat down at the desktop, cracked my knuckles once, and opened 11 months of transaction history on the screen. 11 months. The exact stretch of time I had spent bleeding in a combat zone on the other side of the world. I scrolled and the numbers started hitting me like shrapnel. An $8,000 wire to a name I did not recognize sent 3 weeks back. Below it, 6,000 more. Below that, 4,500. I pulled a legal pad off the shelf and started tallying the columns by hand, the way I reconcile a fuel manifest that refuses to balance. As I worked, a pattern rose up out of the mess. The big withdrawals clustered around my blackout windows, the weeks my unit went dark, and I could not touch a phone if my life depended on it. He kept a calendar. He knew exactly when I would be blind, and he moved the money then every single time. I recognized one of the dates. A $6,000 transfer went out the same afternoon I emailed him a photo of my bunk telling him I missed home and could not wait to sleep in our bed again. He read that message, and then he wired my money into another woman's account. He did both things inside the same hour. When I reached the bottom of the page, my pen stopped dead. Nearly $40,000 had walked out of my accounts quietly, one clean withdrawal at a time. My chest pulled into a hard band across the ribs, and then I forced it loose and kept breathing. This was not a drunk man losing his head on a beach. This was a slow, patient bleed. A vein opened in my finances and kept dripping for the better part of a year. I picked up the phone and called the one person in this state who eats fraud for breakfast, Attorney Jessica Sterling. In financial litigation, she is not a lawyer so much as a predator who happens to carry a bar card. She was at my door inside the hour, laptop bag on her shoulder, heels sharp on the porch boards. We skipped the small talk entirely. We sat down at the dining room table and worked in flat dead silence, clearing the field one statement at a time, slow and certain, the way you walk a minefield. Jessica works the way I run a supply line. She does not get loud and she does not get sad. She opened her own laptop beside mine and started cross-referencing account numbers against public property records, building a map of exactly where my money had gone to ground. Every few minutes, she made a small mark on her pad. She was not gathering sympathy. She was gathering rounds. An hour in, she slid 3 highlighted bank statements across the wood and spun them around to face me. "Emily, look at this," she said, tapping one manicured nail against the top page. "The payments for a luxury apartment, a car dealership, and high-end retail bills. Every single one lists Chloe Davis as the beneficiary." I stared at that name in yellow highlighter until the letters stopped looking like letters. Chloe Davis, my best friend of 20 years. The name went off inside me like a charge on a delay. 1 year back, she had sat in my kitchen right there at my own table, both hands wrapped around a mug of my coffee, tears sliding down her face. She told me the layoffs had cleaned her out. She told me she was one missed rent check away from living in her car. She squeezed my hand across the table and said it soft. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Em. You're the only family that ever actually showed up for me." So I got up, pulled a spare card off my account, and pressed it into her palm. And I told her not to think about paying it back until she was steady again. She was in the room the day I made major. She stood up at the ceremony and cried harder than my own mother did. I had trusted her with the code to my front door and the truth about my marriage. She sat across from me for 20 years, nodding along quietly, memorizing exactly where I was soft. Jessica kept pulling records, and it kept getting worse. A storage unit rented in my name that I had never once set foot in. A credit line opened against my clean history the same month I deployed. Every time I thought I had hit the bottom of it, there was another floor underneath, another door with my name forged onto the lease. My husband had not stumbled into an affair and then gotten greedy. He had sat down months in advance and drawn up a plan. He was going to live off my accounts while I deployed and off my benefits if I never came back at all. He bet against me coming home, and he built a whole life for himself and another woman on the odds of it. She was never going to get steady because she never needed to. While she wept into my coffee about being broke, my husband was already spending my hazard pay to furnish the apartment where the two of them would meet. The luxury unit. The new car off the lot. The shopping bags. My grief paid for the love nest. My deployments covered the rent on the room where they lay in clean sheets and laughed about the fool overseas who kept the money flowing. The affair was only the skin of it. The affair on its own I might have survived. The real crime, the one that turned my blood cold and silent, was the slow, deliberate strip mining of everything I had given a whole life to build. I set the pen down flat on the pad, squared it against the edge, and told Jessica to keep pulling records. We were not finished. Not even close. I stood over the desk that night, staring at the wire transfers laid out in a row and a logistics hole opened in front of me that I could not close. Those were enormous withdrawals. Every account I hold requires a second authorization to move that kind of money, a hard stop I built into the system on purpose. Somebody had walked straight through that wall like it was made of paper. Jessica pulled up the bank's access records and put her pen on the origin column. Every single transaction had come from one location, my home network, this house, my own router inside my own walls. Jessica crossed her arms and told me flat that she wanted a full sweep of every hard drive in the building. I went to the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out my old backup drive, a heavy black brick I had not touched in 2 years, and I plugged it into the tower. The drive spun up with a low mechanical whir that filled the silent room. I ran a deep scan down through the directory tree folder by folder, and near the bottom of a path that nobody would ever open by accident, I found one labeled Side Project. I double-clicked it. My blood turned to ice water in a single second. The folder was full, dozens of files, forged authorization letters, credit applications in my name, wire transfer approvals I had never laid eyes on in my life. And at the bottom of every single document sat my own signature, exact down to the last stroke of the pen. I knew exactly where he had gotten it. Before my last deployment, I had saved one clean copy of my signature on that desktop so he could file our taxes while I was gone. He had made a show of it, actually. He wrapped his arm around me the week before I flew out and told me to go do my job and stop worrying about the boring paperwork that a husband was good for something. One small act of trust left sitting on a hard drive. He took that file, dropped it onto forged documents, and used my own name to rob me blind while I was 10,000 miles away and could not sign a thing. I sat back in that chair and let the full shape of it settle over me. A stranger who steals your identity is a criminal you have never met. The man who steals it from inside your own marriage has to look at your face across the breakfast table every single morning while he does it. He had studied my routines, my logins, my deployment calendar, the exact spot on the desktop where I kept that signature file, and he had turned all of it against me with a wedding ring still on his hand. That is not a mistake a man falls into. That is a job he reports to. Jessica leaned in over the screen, and her eyes narrowed down to 2 thin blades. She tapped her pen hard against the desk once. "Emily, listen to me," she said. "This is no longer a divorce case about splitting assets. Your husband secretly copied your electronic signature, forging the identity of an active-duty military officer to line his own pockets." She let that sit in the air, and then she spelled it out the way an artillery officer calls a grid. Copying the signature of an active-duty officer to move money was not a marriage problem anymore. It was federal wire fraud. It was identity theft against a member of the armed forces. It carried prison, real prison, the kind with a number and a cell. My husband had not just cheated on me with my best friend. He had put on my name like a stolen coat and used it to commit a felony against the same government that signs my checks. The full size of it rose up and tried to tear me open right there in that chair. 20 years, my signature, my name. My service bent into a crowbar and used to jimmy my own accounts. The old weakness climbed up my throat and reached for the surface. Then, 2 decades of command clamped down on it and choked it back to where it came from. I looked up from the glowing screen, my vision narrowing to one cold point, and I gave Jessica a single nod. "Prepare all the legal filings," I said, my voice flat and final. "It's time to drag them in front of the court-martial of life." Jessica did not smile, but something moved behind her eyes. She flipped to a clean page and started building the file the way I would plan a mission, one line at a time. IP logs, timestamps, the signature file, the property trail, every round loaded and labeled. If you have ever had your trust turned into a weapon and pointed back at you by the very people you called family, take 1 second right now to hit that like button and share your own story down in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because I am about to show you exactly how I turned the worst betrayal of my life into a federal indictment. Less than 48 hours after I cut the supply line, Jessica's prediction came true to the letter. She had warned me dry as bone that a parasite without a host does not simply die. It crawls back to the last place that ever fed it. On Saturday afternoon, a beat-up taxi with a coughing engine screeched to a halt at the end of my driveway. The vacation swagger was gone. My husband climbed out looking gray and hunted his shirt, wrinkled his eyes, jumping around the yard. Behind him, my best friend wrestled a heap of designer luggage across the concrete, every bag of it bought with my blood money. 2 days earlier, they had a resort, and dependent, and each other. Now they had a coughing taxi and 3 declined cards between them. I watched them from behind the glass and felt nothing move in my chest at all. The 2 people who knew me best in the world had come to collect from the woman they robbed, and they had the nerve to look annoyed about the walk up the driveway. I stepped out onto the porch, pulled the reinforced security screen shut behind me, and threw the new deadbolt so it locked from the inside. My husband jogged up the steps and grabbed the handle, yanking it hard against the frame, and it did not give an inch. "Emily, the cards aren't working," he barked, forcing his face into a mask of wounded outrage. "We got thrown out of the hotel. Open the door, we need to talk." My best friend shoved past him, her face twisted with the same entitlement I had bankrolled for 20 years. "You're taking this way too far," she snapped, jabbing a finger at the screen between us. "We just need to come inside to grab our things and some cash. The property belongs to both of you." I stood on the safe side of the mesh with my hands clasped loosely behind my back feet, apart the parade rest I can hold for an hour without moving a muscle. I tilted my head and let a small pitying smile touch the corner of my mouth. "Both of you," I said. "If you want half of this house, have his lawyer prove it in court. But for now, didn't you two declare you were never coming back?" Neither of them had an answer for that. My husband's mouth opened and closed. My best friend looked at the locked handle like it had personally insulted her. 20 years I had known this woman. I stood on the safe side of the mesh and looked at her face, really looked at it, and I could not find the person who cried at my promotion anywhere in it. That person had never been real. Somewhere across 2 decades of birthdays and hospital waiting rooms and late-night phone calls, she had been quietly running a tab, adding up every kindness I ever did her, waiting for the day she could cash the whole thing out with my husband on a beach. The friendship was the long con. The affair was just the payday. I reached down and slid a thick brown legal envelope through the mail slot at the base of the door. It landed on the porch boards at his feet with a heavy slap. He snatched it up and tore it open, and I watched his eyes race down the pages. The divorce filing, the asset freeze, the restraining order with his name printed clean across the top. My best friend crowded in over his shoulder to read, and I saw the exact second she understood there was no cash inside this house for her only paper with the weight of a courthouse behind it. The color drained out of both their faces, one shade at a time. You locked everything," he stammered, staring at me through the screen like I had come back from the dead. "Even my business accounts." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I leaned in until my face was inches from the mesh and delivered it soft and clean, one round center mass. "Everything you've been using was built on a foundation that solely bears my name. The game is over, Ethan." He rocked back on his heels. Behind him, my best friend was already doing the math on how fast she could put distance between herself and the man holding a restraining order. The alliance that had gutted me was cracking right there on my own porch, and neither of them had noticed yet. The panic on my husband's face curdled into rage in real time the way it always had right before he broke something. He drew his fist back and drove it into the metal screen, and the whole frame shuddered on its hinges. "You have no right to kick me out of my own house." He roared, spit flying off his lips and speckling the mesh between us. "I'm not going anywhere until you drop these damn orders." For 20 years, that exact voice had done its job inside these walls. That was the voice that ended arguments, that made me lower my eyes and my volume and find a way to make him feel big again. He hit the screen a second time, rattling it hard, waiting for the old reaction, waiting for me to shrink down small. It did not come. I have stood in a bunker while the ground jumped from incoming rounds and kept my hands steady enough to read a map by feel. A wrinkled man punching a locked door was not going to move me 1 inch. I looked at him through the mesh and I saw it clean for the first time. On that front line, men I had known for 6 weeks put themselves between me and death without ever being asked. This man who slept beside me for 2 decades and ate every meal my paycheck bought could not stand the sight of my own front door staying shut against him. That is the whole distance between the two worlds I had lived in. One kind of man bleeds for you, the other kind bleeds you dry, and calls it a marriage. Behind him, my best friend had stopped screaming and started to cry, the ugly kind that shakes the shoulders because it had finally sunk in that the stolen life was draining away right in front of her, and there was no card left in the world that would swipe for her now. My husband kept yanking on the handle. The door held. Everything in this house held now because I had rebuilt it with my own hands to do exactly that. I did not flinch, and I did not answer him. I stood on my porch with my hands folded behind my back, and I waited for the cavalry I'd called in long before either of them ever turned up my driveway. I had filed the protection order 2 days earlier on the same afternoon I served the divorce papers through the mail slot. I walked into that precinct myself, laid the deed and the forgery evidence flat on the desk, and gave them the case number and the name of the judge, so that when the call came, and I knew in my bones it would come, there would be no confusion left about whose house this actually was. My husband thought he was showing up to force his way back inside. He was really walking into a trap I'd set and dated and stamped before he ever climbed into that taxi. The soldiers I served with had a saying: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. I had spent my whole career on the logistics, and now I was going to watch it pay out on my own front lawn. The lights came first. Blue and red strobes rolled across the front lawn and lit up the underside of the maple leaves, throwing hard shadows across the grass. A cruiser eased to a stop against my curb. Officer Barnes climbed out of the driver's door, unhurried, settling his hat, and the rookie Reed came around the far side. This was not the call from 2 mornings back. This time, no frantic voice on a hotel phone in Mexico had sent them chasing a lie to my door. This time they had come to enforce a protection order that Jessica filed with the county court, and this time, my name was the one the law was standing behind. My husband saw the uniforms and swapped masks in half a second flat. He spun off the porch and jogged toward the officers across the wet grass, both arms out, his voice climbing into the thin, cracking whine of a man who has been wronged. "Officers, my wife is going crazy. She's kicking me out of the house," he pleaded, stabbing his finger back over his shoulder at me on the porch, painting me as the dangerous one, running the same play that had worked on teachers and bosses and cops his entire soft life. Up and down the street, the porch lights were flicking on one house after another. Neighbors pulled outside by the strobes. They stood in their doorways in robes and slippers, and they watched. I did not move from my spot. I let him run to the officers and perform. A man who is telling the truth does not need to sprint across a lawn to get his story in first. Barnes did not slow down for a word of it. He raised one flat-gloved hand into the air and cut my husband off mid-sentence, clean, like a blade coming down on a rope. "Mr. Myers, we've reviewed the legal filings," he said, and there was no soft place anywhere in his voice. "This house is the sole property of Major Myers." He took one more step, closing the gap, and let his hand settle easy against his belt, right beside the cuffs. "You have exactly 5 minutes to grab your personal boxes from the garage and leave, or I will put you in handcuffs for disturbing the peace." 5 minutes. The number landed on my husband like a dropped weight and stopped him cold in the middle of the grass. I stood on the porch and watched the last thing he truly owned get taken from him, and it was not the house or the money. It was the story. The story where he was still a man with rights inside these walls, the man of the place, the one who got the final say. That story died right there on the lawn under the flashing lights, and he had no other one ready to put on. His mouth opened and shut. Nothing came out of it. Reed pulled out his phone and started a timer without being told, and the small sound of it beeping to life was the loudest thing in the yard. My best friend stood frozen halfway between the taxi and the porch, clutching a bag she could not pay for, watching the clock run down on the man who had promised her everything on my dime. 4 minutes left. My husband finally moved, stumbling toward the open garage where I'd already stacked his whole life and sealed it in tape. 3 cheap cardboard boxes sat in the mouth of the garage under the bare bulb taped down, labeled in my own block print. Everything of his that was actually his had gone into them, and it had all fit with room to spare. His work boots, a bowling trophy from a league he quit a decade ago, a framed photo of the two of us from a wedding I could barely remember being happy at. 20 years of a man and I had carried the whole sum of it out to the garage by myself in under an hour. He stood over those 3 boxes and stared down at them, and I watched the arrogance drain out of his shoulders until there was nothing left holding him upright. He turned back toward me on the porch, and his face had come completely apart. "Emily, I'll drop Chloe. I'll come back home," he begged, and his voice cracked clean in half on the last word. The shriek that came out of my best friend echoed off every house on the block. She lunged across the grass, grabbed a fistful of his jacket, and started screaming into his face that he had ruined her, that all of this was his fault, cursing him out in the open yard for the whole street to hear. The two of them stood there in the strobing light and finally showed the world exactly what they were to each other, which was nothing 2 thieves swinging fists over an empty vault. The great love that had cost me 20 years and $40,000 was tearing itself to pieces on my lawn in front of the neighbors. I looked down at the man I had married at the wreck of him grabbing at my door, and there was not 1 degree of warmth left anywhere inside me. "You didn't leave because you were brave," I said, my voice flat and quiet and carrying. "And you aren't begging now because you're sorry. You're just terrified because your supply line was cut." I stepped back over my own threshold, took hold of the heavy solid wood door, and swung it shut. The deadbolt drove home with a deep final sound, a bolt seating in a chamber. Through the wood, I could still hear the two of them going at each other out in the grass, their voices rising and breaking under the neighbors' lights. I turned my back on all of it and walked into a house that was finally completely and only mine, and the quiet in there was the cleanest thing I had felt in 11 months. 4 weeks later, I walked into a courtroom, and for the first time in my entire civilian life, I wore my Class A dress uniform through the front door of that building. The dark green. The bronze star sitting over my heart. The rows of service ribbons I had earned in places these people would never have to think about, the same ribbons my husband once called worthless, with his feet propped up on my coffee table. For years I had folded those medals into the bottom drawer under the winter socks, so a small man would not have to feel smaller next to his own wife. That morning, I pinned every last one of them on in the light of my own bedroom, and I folded nothing away ever again. Jessica was already at the table when I came down the aisle, and she stood the second she saw me. She lifted a thick stack of the forged documents and brought it down flat on the table, hard enough to turn every head in the room. "Your Honor, this is not a divorce case," she said, her voice ringing off the wood paneling. "This is a targeted financial fraud committed against an active duty service member serving her country." The room went still. My husband sat at the far table beside a tired-looking lawyer, and he could not hold my eyes for more than a breath. My best friend sat 1 row back, already pale, already coming apart at the seams, before a single piece of evidence had been read into the record. I had spent 20 years making myself smaller in rooms so that men could feel comfortable next to me. I sat in that courtroom in full dress, and I took up every inch of space I had earned. When the judge looked over at me, she did not see a scorned wife. She saw the ribbons and she read them, and I watched her posture shift the same way the officers had on my porch. My husband had spent our entire marriage swearing the uniform meant nothing. In that room, it meant everything, and he had to sit there and watch it bury him. Jessica did not build it slow. She put the IP logs up where the judge could see them and walked the timeline out loud, cold, and exact. Every forged signature had been created on a computer in Ohio inside my own house on specific dates. On every one of those dates, I was boots on the ground in Afghanistan, 10,000 miles away, with the deployment orders and the flight manifest to prove I could not have signed a thing. The math was airtight, and everyone in that room watched it close around the two of them like a gate swinging shut. The pressure cracked my best friend first, exactly the way Jessica promised it would. She could not carry 20 years of loyalty for even 1 hour once the word prison entered the room. She shot to her feet, sobbing, and drove the knife straight into the back of the man she had run off to Mexico with. "Your Honor, he tricked me," she cried, flinging her arm out toward him across the aisle. He said his wife was always deployed, the accounts were loaded, and she would never find out. My husband came up out of his chair, cursing at her loud right there in the middle of the aisle, and a bailiff started moving toward him. The great partnership that had gutted my life was eating itself alive in open court, and I sat straight in my uniform and watched it happen without moving one muscle in my face. Judge Higgins had heard enough. She brought her gavel down hard, one crack that silenced the whole room, and she fixed her eyes on my husband with a look of pure, cold disgust. "Your deceit is an absolute disgrace," she said, biting down on every syllable. "I am stripping you of all property rights." She did not stop there. She ordered the forgery files handed straight to criminal investigators, lifting the whole matter out of divorce court and dropping it into the hands of people who put men in cells. In the space of a single morning, the entire empire of lies my husband had built on my name and my absence went up like paper in a burn barrel. He sat there and watched it turn to ash. No truck was going to save him now. No card, no story, no frantic phone call to a precinct. The woman he betrayed had walked in wearing the very medals he mocked, and she had brought the whole weight of the law in through the door behind her. Out in the marble hallway after it was finished, I heard his shoes hurrying up behind me on the stone. I stopped and turned to face him. He was gray in the face, shaking a man staring down a mountain of debt and a felony charge with real prison behind it. Whatever was left of him reached out one final time. "Emily, can you forgive me? I was so stupid." He choked out, his hands half raised toward me. I held my ground spine straight, the posture of an officer who has nothing left to prove to a beaten enemy. I let him hear every word land. "Stupid is forgetting a birthday," I said. "Secretly forging an identity and using your wife's money to fund a mistress while she dodges bullets in a war zone. That is a vile calculation. I have already evicted you from my mind." I did not wait for a reply. There was nothing left he could say that I needed to hear. I turned on my heel, my ribbons catching the hard hallway light, and I walked out through the tall double doors into the cold, clean air on the other side, and I left him standing alone on the marble with the wreckage of the life he had chosen over me. 3 months later, the divorce was final. I signed the last page at the same mahogany table where Jessica and I had walked the minefield, and then the house went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Clean, settled, mine down to the last nail. There were pale rectangles on the walls where his things used to hang, and I left them exactly as they were. I liked the empty spaces. They were honest. My best friend had cut my husband loose completely by then. The second the badges came out, she rolled on him without hesitation, cutting a deal to cooperate with the investigators and wriggle out from under her own indictment. 20 years of sisterhood, and she sold him for a lighter sentence without a flicker, the very same way she would have sold me. His contracting company folded under the weight of the debt and the felony forgery charge hanging over his head, and the phone calls from old mutual friends started rolling in, telling me how far he had fallen and how bad it had gotten. I did not pick up. I did not care to follow the rest of his downfall. A campaign ends when the objective is secured. Standing around to watch the enemy starve afterward is not a duty. It is only a habit, and I do not keep habits that no longer serve me. I took the same skills that had kept a battalion supplied under fire, and I pointed them at a brand new mission. I launched a small financial advisory fund built for one purpose: to help deployed female soldiers wall off their own money from the opportunistic spouses waiting back home to drain it dry. I knew exactly what those women were up against because I had married it, buried it, and come out the far side still standing. My first client was a young private named Torres, 23 years old, who came to me white-knuckled because her new husband had already started asking for the passwords to her accounts before she had even shipped out once. I sat her down at my kitchen table, the same table where my best friend had once cried for a card, and I taught her how to keep the keys to her own life in her own hand. She did not cry. She took notes. I have never been prouder of anything I built. In the afternoons, I worked the backyard, ripping out the dead beds my husband had left to rot for a decade and turning fresh soil in their place. He never once lifted a shovel back there. It was going to be his someday project like everything else in his life. My hands stayed caked in dirt for weeks, and my back ached at night, and my mind was clearer than it had been in 20 years. I planted things that would come back on their own every spring without needing a single soul to save them. There is a kind of peace that only shows up after you finally stop waiting for the wrong people to turn into the right ones. One cold evening in the fall, my phone buzzed against the glass of the patio table, while I was washing the last of the soil off my hands. Unknown number. I did not need a name attached to it. The tone came through in the shape of the words, alone, small and wheedling and familiar. I really miss you. Can we talk? I read it once standing there in the dark with dirt still under my nails, and I waited to feel something. Nothing came. Not anger, not grief, not the old pull that used to drag me back into making room for him. The message just sat there on the screen, weightless as ash. The pain of that betrayal had come very close to breaking me once. I will not pretend otherwise. But it did one useful thing on its way out. It taught me a hard fact I should have learned 20 years earlier. Love without respect is not love at all. It is just a blood debt one you keep paying and paying with no bottom underneath it. A soldier will bleed for the people standing beside her without a second thought. She will give everything she has for someone who would give it right back. But she does not open a vein for a traitor, and she doesn't hand the keys to her life to a man who has already shown her exactly what he will do with them. I pressed delete, then I blocked the number, and a small confirmation appeared on the screen. Clean and final, the last door closing on a house I would never walk back into. I set the phone face down on the table and left it there. I walked across the patio to the bench I'd built with my own 2 hands that autumn sanded smooth and sat down into the garden I had brought back to life. I sat and I ran my fingers along the letters I'd carved into the armrest, cut deep enough to hold through every winter still coming. I read them in the dark by touch alone. She chose herself and she stayed. Behind me, the lights inside my house burned bright and warm through the windows, spilling gold across the fresh, turned soil. Major Emily Myers had run one final maneuver, and she had won the only campaign that ever truly mattered, the one to take back her own life and keep it. The home front was mine again. The purge was complete, and the ground was finally fully quiet. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones that teach us our absolute loyalty belongs to ourselves first. So if this story reached you tonight, please like this video and subscribe to our channel and share your own moment of breaking free down in the comments below, because in the end, choosing yourself is the greatest victory there is.